Augustine is not someone I associate with uncertainty. And yet about grace, he writes this: "What is grace? I know until you ask me. When you ask me, I do not know." This is a little bit how I feel this morning. But several of you have been asking me, what is grace? Can you define it or describe it or tell us about it? I believe in grace, I experience it, and apparently it is a word that I use often enough that some of you have noticed. But grace is ineffable, it is indescribable. Mark Nepo's phrase, "the breath of something incomprehensible," is perhaps the best description of grace I've heard in a long time. As some of you know, I turn to favorite stories when I lack theological language. And one of my favorite stories is from the book Traveling Mercies, Some Thoughts on Faith, in which the author Anne Lamott describes a moment she calls her conversion experience, a moment when she decided to open the door to something. And to me, the story is all about grace. Anne was at the time a self-described alcoholic, and she had begun attending a little church called St. Andrew's every so often, primarily because it was near a flea market she liked to attend on Sunday mornings. And she'd been hovering in the back of the church and leaving before the service was over. And she writes, "Everywhere I went, I had the feeling that a little cat was following me, wanting me to reach down and pick it up, wanting me to open the door and let it in. But I knew what would happen. You let a cat in one time, give it a little milk, and it stays forever. So I tried to keep one step ahead of it, slamming my houseboat door when I entered or left. About a week later, when I went to church, I was so hungover I couldn't stand up for the songs. But this time I stayed for the sermon, which I thought was so ridiculous, like someone trying to convince me of the existence of extraterrestrials. But that last song was so deep and raw and pure that I couldn't escape. It was as if the people were singing in between the notes. It was weeping and joyful at the same time, and I felt like their voices or something was rocking me in its bosom, holding me up like a scared kid. And I opened to that feeling, and it washed over me. And I began to cry, and I left before the benediction, and I raced home, and I felt the cat running along at my heels, and I walked down the dock, past the potted flowers and a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams, and opened the door to my houseboat and stood there and hung my head and said, "Okay." I took a long, deep breath, and I said, "All right. You can come in." I love the idea of grace. I love the word grace with all of its many meanings. I love that old traditional religious definition of grace as a blessing bestowed by God, unearned, unasked for. I love that grace is what we say before a meal to give thanks. Grace is the quality of being at ease in your body. Grace is a certain kind of ineffable loveliness, often seen in children and elders who don't care what they look like. Grace is the ability of some rare people to make you feel comfortable and at home and like you were exactly who they were waiting for. I also believe that grace is one of the most important aspects of faith. But I find that what I mean by grace in this spiritual sense is hard to describe. Numerous theologians have written about grace, of course. They have written about its meaning and its role in Christianity particularly. But the New Testament's position on the subject of grace is not straightforward at all. The Apostle Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians the beautiful words, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is a gift of God and not a result of works, so that no one may boast." And yet equally compelling are the words of the Apostle James, who writes, "Faith without works is dead." For centuries, the Christian church has struggled and argued and fought over this paradox. Are we saved by God's grace, or do we effect our salvation by our own attempts to live ethically and faithfully? Unitarians came down on the side of good works having an impact on our salvation, but about how we live and move in the world. The Christian theologian James Dunn writes that in the story of the birth of the Christian church as told in the New Testament, grace is never merely an attitude or a disposition of God, but it consistently denotes something much more dynamic. There is a sense of God acting in the lives of women and men through grace, a sense of grace as engagement, as holy presence. Now, I confess I think I resonate most with Anne Lamott's decidedly unorthodox theology that grace is like a stray cat. It is something quiet and subtle. We don't know where it came from. It is something that disappears if we lunge at it or try to grab it. Something whose comings and goings we are not always aware of and certainly cannot control. We just look up, and there it is. In my experience, grace comes in moments, and it is often like that moment Anne Lamott describes while listening to her congregation sing, a moment when she felt like their voices or something was rocking me and holding me up like a scared kid, and I opened to that feeling and it washed over me. I think this sense of being held aloft is important. It's what the poet Levertov is referring to when she writes of her yearning to attain free fall and float in the Creator's embrace, like a swimmer lying face to the sky or a hawk resting upon the air. I think it is also what the poet Mark Nepo is invoking when he writes of watching the painful struggle of that fly on its back, legs spinning and going nowhere. I thought to swat it, he said, but something in its struggle was too much my own. So he breathes on it, and it rights itself and flies away. And he says, I continue to stare at the latch, hoping that the breath of something incomprehensible would right me and enable me to fly.